everybody. I'm Matthew. I'm the owner of Dooley, which is a boutique social media studio here in Cincinnati, Ohio. Thanks everybody for joining our social media show and tell webinar series. Since today's topic is all about analytics, I want to kick things off with just a quick pulse check. So drop in the chat if you are more of a creative person or analytical. So maybe use the artist palette emoji if you're more right-brained, and a bar chart emoji if you're more of a left-brained person. And as with all of our show and tell webinars, I feel really proud to show off another one of our Dooley teammates. Amanda, who's about to hop on here, is our Director of Analytics. And since joining Dooley, she's really elevated how we think about analytics and data. And in doing so, she's really helped us drive better performance for our clients. And so today she's going to walk us through how to give data a soul. She's going to show us how to connect numbers to narrative in a way that actually moves people to act. So with that, Amanda, the show is yours.
All righty. Can everyone see myself? Hello. As Matthew said, I'm Amanda. I am the analytics lead here at Dooley. And today we are going to talk about all things data and storytelling. And I have a lot packed in here, and I tend to talk really fast if we run short on time. So we're just going to jump right in. Feel free to jump in with questions if you have them as we go along. Right, so as Matthew said, we're going to talk about data with a soul, and just how do we bring some life to the numbers that matter most, and so that we can make sure that we leave an impression and drive an impact with the data that we have, because it can be very powerful when used appropriately. So just a quick note here, there is a giveaway at the end of the webinar. So one person or attendee will win kind of a Data with a Soul library bundle with a couple books around it if you want to learn more. Plus, if there is a deliverable or a deck or some report that you have that you think needs a little extra love or needs a little help with a story of what it's trying to tell, you can have a session with me and we can chat it up and see what we can do to apply some of the aspects we talk about today to your own work. So that'll be announced at the end. Stick around. All right, so we'll start here with stories are just data with a soul. This obviously ties very closely to the title of this webinar, but this just really encompasses the idea that data is objective, it can be dry, it can be a little bit forgettable if there's too much of it, which means it can be overwhelming. So by pairing it with a story, it gives it some warmth, it gives it some emotion, and it helps elicit more action from the data than you would get if you just tell data by itself. It kind of adds a little bit of human experience to something that can be very stoic or a little bit cold. So we're going to get into talking about that and just about how we can do that. So a little bit about Dooley's perspective on data storytelling. So this is just a little write-up about our perspective personally. So at Dooley, we aren't just data analysts. We try to be data storytellers, and we aren't telling just any brand story. We're trying to tell your story. We're going to tell you your story. We want this to be a very personal experience. We want to know what your hesitations are, and we want to partner with you to understand your goals, your challenges, where you want to go, and we want to make a plan that uses your data to get you there in a way that you understand exactly what your data is telling you. We dig into the why, so we can arm you with a cohesive understanding of your social plus efforts and help you understand, were you successful or are there opportunities to grow? It seems like such a simple question, but with so much data out there today, it can be challenging to really understand, were we successful or were we not? And then our goal is to transform that data into a compelling narrative that helps you understand your brand and your data and drives informed decision making or action or discussion or some sort of next step, so that we can use the data to make better choices and improve our goals moving forward. So let's get into it. Data and storytelling, they really are the perfect partnership. Maybe on the surface, they might not seem tied together because data is all numbers and stats and data, and again, very objective, where storytelling is very emotional. But really, to be successful, one can't thrive without the other one. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Data provides credibility to your story, and storytelling drives action from your data. So if we think about that, data itself is very objective. It gives the raw material for a story. And the storytelling is able to provide context, meaning, action. It helps your audience really understand what the data is telling them so that they can understand the implications and the potential actions. So if we think of an economist and an author, they might not seem like connected professions, but really they both need data and storytelling to be effective. If we think about Grey's Anatomy, which is actually still on that I didn't realize, but it's like in 22 seasons. Anyway, this show, if this show would have launched, it would have had wild inaccuracies. There would have been misdiagnoses, there would have been erroneous procedures, the doctor wouldn't have known what a scalpel was. If all that data was wrong, it wouldn't have had the credibility and the authenticity that it needed to last 22 seasons. People would have been like, they do not know what they are talking about and would have moved on to something else. So that's why those shows have these technical people that make sure that there is accuracy in those scenarios because it's critical to the success and the credibility of it. If you think of an economist, let's say they're trying to explain the economy and they just throw out a bunch of numbers, the GDP, consumer confidence index, stagflation, inflation, deflation, all the flations. And then they just say, and that's why the economy is the way it is. People are kind of left being like, okay. But if you start tying that those numbers to people's stories and how it's impacting them in a good way or a negative way, or how it's impacting their ability to have the American dream, it starts to have a lot more impact for what, and you start to understand where what the data is telling you. So that's why they do go well together, and good data storytelling is definitely a skill, and it can be a little bit difficult and a little bit mentally taxing because you definitely need, the logic of the left brain and the creativity of the right brain. But when you get it together, it can be a really, really effective way to tell your data story to your stakeholders. All right. So then how do you do it? That's like the next logical question, right? Like, yep, we get it, but how do we do it? And how do we do it well? So we're going to go through about 5 steps for effective data storytelling. We're going to go to each one of these in a little bit more detail. So the first one we're going to talk about is the importance of making it personal. Then how to choose the most relevant data and set expectations. I'm a big expectations person, so we definitely want to have those set prior to any projects. And then once a project runs, understand the why, find the story or the narrative that explains what happened. Then we'll go into the importance of context and visuals. And then at the end of it, we always want to inspire action, because if you have all this information and you don't do anything with it, it'll likely fall flat. All right. So we will dive in to the first one around making it personal. So this one is really just about understanding your audience. So a success metric for one stakeholder may be very different from the success metric of a different stakeholder. And you should understand those and know what those KPIs are so that you can shape your deliverable or personalize your deliverable to have the maximum impact. So at a really high level here, a CMO of a company might have different needs and expectations from a deliverable or a report than your direct client or manager that's in between the two of you, right? So it's really important to know who cares about what and how they like the data presented to them so that you can cater your deliverable in a way that's going to resonate with them and they're going to know what to do with it. Because I think that sometimes with data, when we have so much of it, it can be very overwhelming and people just kind of don't know what to do with it after that. So when we think of the application of this, it's really about understanding your audience's interests and again, what they care about, but then also their triggers, their motivations, any hesitations they have, so that you can tailor that communication. I love when a client shares a little bit of a hesitation they have because it helps me anticipate potential questions they may have or potential pushback. So an example of this is we work with clients sometimes that focus a lot of their efforts on lower funnel um, tactics. And sometimes we'll come in and say, hey, we need to be more upper funnel. We're going to take some of your funds and we're going to put it into some upper funnel awareness to help that expand the audience that then we're going to use for retargeting. It's all going to be an effort to increase sales, but maybe they've done awareness campaigns and they haven't been able to quantify them, so they get a little hesitation. You can see it on the call. You can see a pause. You can see them kind of take a breath and be like, okay, I trust you. We're going to roll with it. When I see that, I love it. I note it. And it's like, okay, now I know what I hear there is that I need to help them understand the process when we go back and tell the story about how those changes impacted the results that we have today. The application of this is really just understanding their mindset and understanding their perception, because that's how they're going to approach the situation. That's how they're going to, maybe come into it again with some questions or a little bit of hesitations. It's great. You can anticipate those and you can cater the deliverable to that. So a little bit of an example of this. So let's say you have a CMO or a board member, and they likely are most interested in just the bottom line. Did we move the needle or not? Did we hit the return we needed? Whereas if you have an intermediary, a client, it's between you and the CMO or a manager, they also care about that. But they also might want to know more about what caused the movement. If we did a test and learn, what were the results? What optimizations did we uncover? What can we do moving forward? So those deliverables might look different. I did see, I believe there's some people on here that were in the nonprofit space. Another example of different audiences and understanding them to make it personal is basically an internal and an external audience. So if you think of an internal audience, maybe they care about total donations or project efficiency, so they can have more of an impact. Where if you're going externally, they might care more about what percent of their contribution actually affects those in need. And so the story of that and how you tell that is very different. And if you just take an internal document and put it on your site for external people to read through, they're probably going to get a little lost and it's not going to be personalized to them. It's going to be hard for them to find their answers. So think of who's getting your deliverable and make sure that you understand where they're coming from and cater it to them as much as possible. So this is just a little sample slide that we throw in quite a few decks. If the deck is going to be going to the CMO or the CEO or a board member or somebody above our client. So, and this is an example of one where the final recipient doesn't really want to know all the details. They're overwhelmed by it. They just want to know, did we achieve what we said we were going to do or not? Was the impact positive or was it negative? And so, and this is an example of the client cared about overall sales. And our part of that was to expand the audience. So we had, so that lower funnel tactics could retarget against that audience. So we had to build that audience. We had to have those impressions. So this really hits on, we did our impressions, we did our part. It gives a little context that we're above goal and a little bit of how we did that. Also, it says, yep, we had a lift in sales. This is where it was. And we did it this way. It was through purchases and not an increase in average order value or whatnot. And then this slide usually comes with a slide after it that has like written learnings and next steps. And then that's it. Then that leader can take these two slides, have an idea of what happened and what we're going to do about it, and they don't have to leaf through a whole deck. There's typically a large appendix that has a lot of other information that maybe your client or another person might be interested in. So it's still valuable. It's just maybe not valuable to that audience. So I learned very early in my career that a lot of my work gets put in the appendix, and I'm okay with that if that helps tell the story to the right people, because it's still there and it's still valuable, but it just might not be for the person who's looking at the deck and at the final recipient. All right. So next, we're going to talk about choosing the most relevant data and setting expectations. I love this section, so we're going to dive right in. Obviously, in today's world, there are a million metrics somebody can look at in terms of driving success and how they determine success. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to pick one when we have so much data at our fingertips. All of these could be a client's KPI, but they can't all be it, right? You have to make prioritization. You have to make choice. Any of these could work. They can't all work, because if you have all of these, then you're going to be in a cycle of indecision. You're not going to know what to do with it. I always give the example, if you have 10 KPIs and 5 go up and 5 go down, is it good? You just don't know. So at some point you need to take prioritization. You need to prioritize what's important, and it's important to have those conversations early and often with your clients to check in with them. So around choosing the most relevant data. So again, with so much data at our fingertips, analysis by paralysis is very real. Too many data points can divide attention, they can diminish impact, and it can prevent action. It can cause swirl. I once saw a stat that was like, data is not like your kids. You don't have to love every piece of data equally, which I love. So just if something's not working for you, you don't have to use it, right? It's going to cloud the story if you have too much data in there. So when you have too much data in there, that's when it makes it hard to answer the question of, were we successful? Because you just don't know. So it is the role of the data storyteller to remove that noise, to focus people's attention on what matters, what can move the needle, what you can optimize against, so that you can use the data in a way that helps you improve your business moving forward. So that's where we're going to get into something we call the North Star. Okay, trust me, I know I just had a whole slide about there's so many metrics to look at, and here I'm kind of talking about another one. So I get the irony there, but in many cases, this thought process or this methodology has helped us, or this mindset has helped us have conversations with clients to help set prioritization. So, what is your North Star? Your North Star is really the one metric that will determine success. It's the one impact point that is the most compelling for your stakeholders. So, an example of this is we had a client that they needed to hit a 3 return on ad spend. That was it. That was the final straw. And if we didn't hit our 3 on return on ad spend, the partnership was done. And so we could talk about how we increase sales to, or how we increase order values or purchases. We could talk all about that, and that could be positive. But if we didn't hit a 3 ROAS, it was not going to matter. So what that did is that gave us a lot of clarity when it came to our strategy and how we approach things, because we knew that's what we needed to hit at the end of the day. And it was very helpful to know that we were all aligned on that was the final metric that mattered to the board, and that they had a board member, they had a board, and that's what all of their marketing tactics had to hit was a 3 ROAS. So when we think about that, your North Star should be the focal point of your data story. And there are going to be other data points that help fill out the story, but they should all tie back to your North Star. And if they don't, then we'll go through the thought process there of, is that data important? So in the example that we just talked about, if they have a 3 ROAS as their North Star, and we talk, maybe some of the supporting metrics are increases that we saw in sales or in purchases, but then we're like, but this content over here had great engagement. Cool, it's good to know, but again, it doesn't tie to the North Star. So then you can ask your question, is this part of the story that I need to tell? Is this just something good I want to share, or does it need to be taken out or reframed? Maybe it needs to be tied to the North Star. Well, we have this content that has high engagement, they have a higher propensity to purchase. Like, so just think about this as everything should tie back to this. So here's a little North Star checklist that I have because I love a checklist. So again, does the North Star represent what my stakeholders care most about? Again, that is just that prioritization conversation. So everybody's aligned on the same kind of direction moving forward. Does my stakeholder understand and agree with this data point? And it seems simple, but I know sometimes people love a proprietary metric that is something unique or different. And when I have seen those, or I've seen those in my career, it struggles a little bit because maybe your client knows, or your direct point of contact understands that proprietary point, but they can't communicate it to the people above them. So then it just kind of falls flat. So you want to make sure everyone understands exactly where we're going, or what direction we're going, and agree with it. Also, do I have a goal set for my North Star? So we'll talk about the importance of, again, expectation setting and goal setting in a little bit. Do we have a common source of truth? So this is something that we've had with a client where there's so many attribution tools out there, then there's a new one being introduced every week. So it's always good to make sure that you guys are operating from the same source of truth. We had a client where we had historically used Shopify, we were reporting out of Shopify. Ends up they got a second attribution tool that they were using, and it had different numbers, and we didn't know that initially. So our initial reports were a little bit off from what they were expecting. So we were able to reformat them using Northeme, but it's just great to know. It's good to know that you guys are both talking the same language and pulling the same numbers and looking at the same data. Can this data point drive action? Obviously, you want something to come out of the data, so you want to make sure that you have control over change, or that you can do something with it moving forward. And then, are there any data points that my client cares about that act in opposition of my North Star? So this one I added a little bit later after some experience that I had, and the most basic example that I can think of, this is a quick example, is if we had a client that they initially wanted to focus on awareness efforts. So we were trying to expand their audience, build this impressions, and later they were like, well, I still care about engagement too. And what we were finding is not a lot of it, but in some cases, the formats or the strategies or the messages that we were using to build an audience and awareness weren't the most engaging. So we saw a drop in the engagement rate. So we have to have that conversation of, hey, I hear it's important to you, but which one is more important? Which one are we optimizing our content against so that we can hit what we want at the end of the year? So a little bit around North Star there, which may lead to the next question of what's the difference between a North Star and a KPI that everyone knows a good old KPI. in my mind, the North Star should be one single metric. It should be like sales, or again, the 3 return on ad spend. It's not uncommon today for clients to have more than one KPI. And in some cases, it makes sense, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I know KPI started as a key performance indicator. I feel like now people are adding an S to that, and that's key performing indicators. And we're starting to have, 1, 2, 3, maybe a little adding to that. So your North Star again helps with that prioritization. It should align with the client's overall business objectives. So again, if they want to have sales be their overall business objective and increase in sales, the North Star should tie to that. Whereas KPIs, they sometimes can act as a proxy or a leading indicator for the North Star if the data is not always available, which kind of spoiler alert to one of the last points. But an example of this is we had a client that needed to drive registrations. And the issue with that is the registrations were in a separate database and the registration numbers were going to come later, well after the campaign was done. So while their North Star was registrations, we could not optimize our work on registrations because the data just wasn't going to be available in a timely manner. So we had to use clicks to the registration site as our KPI because that's what we could work against while the campaign was running. Your North Star, again, is one metric that should remain consistent across campaigns, while KPIs can vary. And where this plays into a fact where we've seen this is if the client is really looking to drive sales. But again, if we go back to that full funnel example where it's like maybe they've been running all lower funnel ads, we say, hey, we're going to do a full funnel approach. We're going to expand your audience, which then we're going to use as a retargeting pool for campaigns later. That awareness campaign that you start to build your audience is important. The KPI, that is going to be getting as many impressions as you can at the most efficient cost. That's your KPI. Then you get to traffic and you want to get to the site. You want to get them to the site so that you can understand what they like to serve them more personalized ads in the conversion campaigns at the bottom of the funnel. All steps are in an effort to drive sales because that conversion campaign should be significantly more effective if the audience is primed and ready to purchase. But the KPIs of the different steps are a little bit different, all in the service of sales, which is your North Star. And again, this kind of goes back to number 2. This was a spoiler alert. Sometimes there is a lag time between an event and the North Star's data availability, going back to the registration example. So sometimes you do need a KPI that you can use for in-campaign optimizations that is tied very closely or as close as you can get to your North Star so that you can make changes. You're not left just running a campaign and saying, well, we don't have the data till the end and hope it worked and cross your fingers. Sometimes you need, a little mediary between that so that you can still improve where you can. Okay. All right. Data is just a summary of 1,000 stories. Tell a few of those stories to help make the data meaningful. Again, this just speaks to the importance of being selective. And by being selective, you typically lead to having more impact. So the more data you leave out, kind of in a way helps you highlight actually the data that you leave in because it helps people focus on what you think is most important. So we've been through the North Star. We know, let's say we worked with our client. We know that this is the one thing that we want to do. Next is setting those goals and expectations that we talked about. So once you have your North Star and you want to set your goals, sometimes this can be a little intimidating if you don't know where to start. My stance on that pretty much is the more granular you can get, the better accuracy you're going to have. So these are some steps to think about when you are setting your goals. Make sure you have the defined objective of whatever campaign or work you're setting a goal for. Understand the channels at play, understand the tactics that are planned. And then once you know that, you can take that larger goal and you can break it down into smaller known parts. And then you can, within those parts, use historical data or industry information to get an estimate of how each tactic or channel is going to play. Then you can look for anomalies and adjustments. So we'll talk about that a little more in a slide or two, but I will say if you don't have these 3, if you don't have the objective, if you don't understand the channels that you have at play, you don't understand the tactics that are planned, it's going to make steps 4, 5, and 6 very difficult. So you want to make sure you have all of those, you have an understanding of all that before you really start to make your goal, or else it's just going to be difficult to do so. All right. So now it comes time to actually setting your goals. There's a couple different ways that you can do this. When we do this, I prefer to start with my client's own historical data if it's available, just because it's the most reflective of their audience and what they have historically done and what they've historically expected. Then we can adjust for trends or changes that we are making in the strategy or the campaign. And then if we need to, we can supplement with industry benchmarks so that we really root all the goals and expectations in data and flag any assumptions that or caveats that might need to be called out. A lot of times I find that frustrations, whether it's personal or in business or whatever, is just comes from misaligned expectations. So if we can do that early, makes everybody's life easier. So in this example, let's say we need to calculate, we need to estimate how many online registrations are going to come from all this campaign work. Okay, you might be like, okay, where to start? I don't know what to do. Where to start that? Again, break everything down into what you do know. And this is why those first 3 steps are important. So let's say we're going to have search, we're going to have social media, we know we're going to be at some event-based marketing. And then you break that down and say, okay, within search, we know we have paid, we know we have organic, we know for social, we're going to use influencers. And then what you do is you get down to the lowest level that you feel is helpful or that you know. And that's where you start to make goals that will then sum up and ladder up to the final one, right? So let's say you have a branded search campaign. Look at what historically your branded search campaigns have done and see if you can pull anything from that, make adjustments that you need. If you haven't done an influencer content, look for industry benchmarks and how influencer content typically runs in terms of click-through rate or conversion rate or signups or whatever you can find that's closest to what you need. And then when you find all those, you can kind of roll it up to the top and you can kind of get an online registration number. Or sometimes you can go from the top down. So in a case, let's say you're doing something with paid, you know your spend. Either you can use your own historical cost per impression, or you can find industry benchmarking. You can just work down. You can have as many layers of this triangle, oopsies, as you want. But this, impressions, clicks, purchases, sales, and you can kind of get down to a number. All that to say, I fully believe that your goals are a grounding point to offer perspective later. Unless you're trying to estimate something that's directly tied to spend, where you can just spend more if you're hitting it or not hitting it, or spend less if you are over hitting it, um, there's going to be a gap between what you estimate and what your actuals are. And that's okay. It's unlikely that you are going to nail it straight on the head. So understand that your first pass is your first take at it. See how it goes. Anytime a goal involves a human interaction where a person needs to click or purchase or something else, there's always going to be an element of uncertainty that you're going to have to use historical data or find an estimate for. And then see how close you were. Do the best with the information that you have, document as you go, and troubleshoot it. And then the next time, you're going to refine it. And the more you do it, the grounding point's going to become more stable and more accurate as you go. What's also great about going through this process is you know exactly how you were expecting to get to your goal. So if you get to the end of it and you don't have, and there is that gap, you have a starting point to understand why. Did search not deliver what we expected? Did social over deliver what we were expecting? Whatever it is, you kind of know how you were supposed to get there. So you can deconstruct it backwards and understand where maybe you exceeded or where you maybe missed the mark. Which leads into our next section, which is really understanding the why and finding the narrative. So this is the part I love. It's also, you have to watch out because you can get in some really deep rabbit holes. So understanding the why. We just talked about how you set your goals and expectations for your North Star. That's great. And then you have what really happened. And then you have all that happened in the middle here. That's that gap that we talked about. And don't get frustrated by that because that's where the story lies. That's where you have learnings and optimizations and you can make improvements and changes. So understanding that gap is really understanding the why. And that's where you can be a little sleuthy detective and have a little fun. So understanding the why. Numbers show what happened. The story tells the why behind the what. So understanding the drivers behind data performance and fluctuations is what helps turn those raw metrics into actionable insights, which is what everybody wants, right? We want to do something with our data. So early in my career, I had someone tell me about the 5 whys, where you just keep asking why 5 times to get to the root of the cause. And it has stuck with me. My 3-year-old's great at this. She just keeps asking why, probably more than 5 times, but she's learned this skill very early and it has stuck with me as well. So for what it's worth, you don't always have to go down all 5 levels, but by continuously asking why a couple times, you usually can find something interesting or something that helps you understand what happened. So we're going to do a real life example here. We had a client who, when we started working with them, really cared about awareness efforts. They wanted to expand awareness of certain service lines within their organization. And we were hitting that, and that was great. But then the next year they were like, actually, we kind of want to have a shift here and we want to actually use our social to build communication with our audience. We want to use social to build this social proof that and give us a little bit of validity in that space. So we want to focus more on engagement, drive engagement in our social channels. Great, wonderful, awesome. Unfortunately, when we had looked back at the year prior, we actually found out that while we nailed our awareness objective, the engagement rate had actually declined. So knowing that was a new focus, we needed to figure out why. So we started to ask why, started to dig into this a little bit. And sometimes the why can be very deep. Sometimes it can be, you can ask why 5 different times and five different ways that it impacted the results, right? So in this case, it's more of the latter. So we noticed the social engagement rate had declined. We started to look at what's different, what changed that we did between the year prior and the year that we had taken it over. One of the things that we knew that had changed is we changed the amplification process. So they had historically used the boost button. When we took it over, we started using Ads Manager because it was just easier to organize the work. We had more control over the objectives and it made sense. But that actually had an impact on results. What we were finding is even if we did the same piece of data, the results were different. The boost button actually had higher engagement than Ads Manager. So we're trying to get to figure out why. And what we found out after digging is that based on Facebook's algorithm and how it works, the audiences were actually different whether we used the boost button or Ads Manager. When the boost button was used, the audience that they targeted was heavier towards the followers. So it's typically like a 40% followers, 60% non-followers, or 30-70, somewhere in that area. When we looked at the same content through Ads Manager, we actually found out that the follower, non-follower breakout was very different. It was about 10% followers and 90% non-followers. So where that plays into it is logically people who are more familiar with your brand, have chosen to participate with your brand, are naturally going to also engage more with your content. So it made a logical line as to why we saw that content through the boost button performed better. So what do we do about it? This is where then you find the action. So then we just tested into an optimal audience mix using Ads Manager. And we just kind of test and learned into our way into what felt right. When we did that, we still were allowed to have the objective control. We still able to have the organization, and we actually increased the engagement rate for the engagement-based campaigns by I think 88% or something like that. So it was great. Also, and along with that, there was other reasons that we saw that we felt led to the decline in the engagement rate. One of them was knowing that we had to hit from an awareness effort, we increased our posting cadence because we wanted to get out there and hit more people. So how that impact results from an engagement standpoint, we had to create new content. You know, people love to celebrate like awards or people, but there's only so many that you can do. So we leaned into education content. So how did that impact results? Again, this is where you can ask why a couple times. Maybe you don't need to go to 5, but you'll get there. We found that education content generally drives lower raw engagement numbers when they're summed up in total, which makes sense. It doesn't mean that the education content's bad. It just means that when you give education content, it might not apply to everybody. If you're a home improvement store and you have a video on how to install a ceiling fan, it might be the best ceiling fan installment video ever made, but it's only going to be relevant to people who need to install a ceiling fan. So your audience is a little bit more narrow in what may be interested in the education content. So what do you do about it? You don't stop doing education content. You just have to reevaluate the role and how that content plays in the overall strategy. And this all digs into just, we could have just said, hey, boosting helped engagement. Let's just go ahead and run with that. But if you don't ask why, you don't understand how we got there, then you could go down a bad path. So always ask why. Understand the story of why. Once you have and you understand the why, then you can start to put the narrative together, right? So this is where you start to give life to your data. There's not going to be anything real groundbreaking here, but it does help give a logical setup for how to tell the narrative. So obviously you want to create a clear setup right early on. Now, if you think of like maybe a nonprofit where you need to inspire people to join you in something, this could be something where it's a very inspirational number or factor. If you're doing more like the corporate side of things, maybe it's a corporate campaign, I like to have a very clear setup that lets them know why we did what we did, how the campaign was set up, why did we do it this way based on what their needs were, so that the person on the receiving end of it can come into the report with the right mindset. So a little bit of an example here, we're going to go back to the nonprofit example, a clear setup. One thing that I've seen where that's done this very well is Charity Water, where they basically said there's 2 billion people in the world that don't have water. That's why you should care, because that's a lot of people, and that's a really basic need. So then they want to convey their key message, which is the next one, which basically says their North Star is they want to give more people clean water. And by donations, they've been able to give 20 million people clean water. That's their message. If you go back to the corporate example, this could be that they drove an X% lift in sales. That's what you wanted us to do. That's what we did. The next step is then to support that with relevant data. Again, this should always tie back to your North Star. If it doesn't, then maybe rethink if it needs to be in there. Think of this in the Charity Water example. Maybe they humanize that number and they tell the stories of people who've gotten clean water. Again, this all ties back to the issue they're trying to solve, the North Star that they want to achieve, but this all is just kind of helping round out the story of why it's important. And then you want to close with action. Prioritize these actions if you can. Sometimes when you uncover stuff, you can have multiple recommendations, and sometimes that can be overwhelming. So if you have a few that you really like, or you really think are going to be strong or more impactful, prioritize those, because as much as we don't always want to hear it, budget is typically limited. So we want to make sure we have the most impactful stuff first. So this is just how, 4 steps to think about as you're creating that narrative. Okay. The other part of this narrative creation that has been helpful and was told to me very early in my career was the importance of ensuring your support data is relevant, compelling, actionable, and making sure that there's a purpose for everything that's in a deck. Again, you don't just want to be noise. So this is the so what, or the what, so what, now what system. I was just told it was called this. There actually has a real name called Borton's Model of Reflection, in case anybody was curious, but it's also what, so what, now what. So how this works is basically your what is your primary data points, typically a numerical or performance metric, doesn't always have to be, but it's typically where it is. So in this case, let's say that going back to that full funnel example, that we found out that lower funnel product-centric ads perform better when they're served in succession after an awareness campaign, because it leads to larger sales. People are more primed to buy. That's great. Which kind of was a preview to the so what, is this tells why the audience should care about this. By running this preemptive campaign, we expanded our warm audience. We were able to have a better return. So then now what? This tells your audience what they should do with the information. And this is saying, this is where, okay, we saw this worked. Let's run a test where we do more of this structure rather than strictly lower funnel, and see how it runs. Or say, hey, this has seemed to work. Now what I think we need to do is we need to refine the creative, or whatever it's going to be. But this what, so what, now what model helps make sure that what you have in your deck or your deliverable it matters. Because sometimes it is, even as we get lost in the data, sometimes it's easy to put stuff in that you think is interesting or cool, but it's not really part of the overall story. Okay, so now we're on to number 4, provide context and visuals to give perspective and clarity. So this is something where context is necessary to determine success. If you do not provide context, the numbers can be misleading, oversimplified, or lead to the flat out wrong strategy, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. And context can be a lot of different forms. They can have, it can be goals or benchmarks if you've hopefully set them. If you haven't, you can always use historical data, relevant comparisons, or industry benchmarks. The watch out here, though, is not all context is created equal, and it's important to share relevant context, or context that helps really convey the story in the way that you want it conveyed, because different points of comparison can dramatically impact a stakeholder's perspective. So we're going to tell a little story about how context can make data points feel substantial if you want them to be. So according to ChatGPT, there are 100 million pickup trucks worldwide. Random stat, but that's what it said. For context, that is the equivalent of every person in the states of California, Texas, New York, and good old Ohio owning a pickup truck. 1 in 3 people in the US would own a pickup truck. This feels substantial when you think of these numbers. If you think of every person when they show those crowded California highways, all those cars would be pickup trucks. Every person in the state of New York who lives in an apartment would have a pickup truck. It makes you feel again like this is a substantial number. You could also take this this kind of macro comparison, if you want to give a, another example of it, this is a picture of my street. These are the first 4 houses on the street. Looks like you can see 2 cars there, but there are 3 of these houses have families. So they're all in the state of Ohio. According to this context, every parent, kid, baby would own a pickup truck. That means in this picture, there would be 18 pickup trucks. So again, it helps make the number feel substantial. You can find data to support that the number is substantial. The fact is that the Ford F-150 is the most selling truck vehicle in the United States and Canada. It makes it feel prevalent. But one thing we have to consider is that our points of comparison or our points of reference are a little bit different. We're talking about trucks worldwide, and all of our examples are within the United States. That's not necessarily a bad thing because people can understand things that they can relate to. So these are points within the United States. It helps them understand it a little bit. But it can also sway your perspective. If we really think about that, that there are 100 million trucks worldwide scale, it's actually only 6% of the vehicles worldwide. Still equals to the population of those states, but it's really only 6% of the vehicles worldwide. It makes that same stat feel a little bit more inconsequential when you look at it at an equivalent scale. So the whole point of this is just to understand that context is valuable, but it can also be very swayed. So you want to make sure you're very choiceful in how you present the data and also how you receive data. So a quick example that I've seen before is, let's say you have sales data and the person who's presenting it to you says, hey, we did a 10% increase in sales. Sounds great. Great. I love increasing my sales. Unless you were supposed to hit a 25% increase in sales, or unless you spent 50% more to get those 10% in sales. So context is always important. Make sure you understand it. Make sure you agree with it. If you're the one presenting the context, make sure that it is fair in its comparison and that it definitely conveys the story that you want it to convey. So, little idea there. Now we're going to have a little side pivot, but related story. AI. AI is everywhere. I was at lunch with a coworker and she basically asked, do you think analytics is a viable career with the rise of AI? My gut says I sure as heck hope so because that's my job. But after thinking, I do also still think that there is. Because while AI relies on pattern recognition, it works in numbers, it still needs context to understand. It lacks human experience. So I talked to a different friend about this and she was saying, yeah, we're trying to use AI, but it can be hard to discern what information AI all needs to tell an accurate story. So a little bit of story time here. We had a client who ran a promotion on Tuesdays and we started to support that in kind of FY 23-24, picked up that support FY 24-25. So I wanted to see has our support impacted sales? And what we found is that when I pulled sales data from 2022 all the way to 2025, there were some odd spikes. So we started looking at day of week. So there was spikes on Mondays, which really picked up in November. It wasn't every Monday. It was their highest sales were on January 23rd, which was a Monday. Sometimes the sales spiked on a Friday. One time it was on a Monday. And so there were some anomalies there. I fully believe AI could have helped me identify those anomalies quicker. What I am not convinced is that AI would have been able to tell me why we had them. So if anybody wants to drop in the chat their thoughts of maybe why we saw that those numbers, let me know if you have any thoughts, because it was, again, it started in November, ran through about early January. It was mostly on Mondays, but not every Monday. One time it was on a Friday, once it was on a Tuesday. If anybody has any thoughts, feel free to throw them in the chat. Based on time, I'm going to kind of keep rolling. But I'm going to give you the spoiler alert of what it was, just so you know. It actually ties those spikes tied to Bengals wins. The client had a promotion that ran, and if the Bengals won, then the promotion happened the following day. So that's actually what drove those spikes. And the January 23rd was their last win of the game. So out of curiosity, I whitelisted the information. I put it in AI just to see a private AI tool to see what it would be. These are not their exact numbers for the sake of this presentation, but it's similar in the sense that these are when the spikes happen. And what was interesting is AI accredited all of these to holidays. It was the start of the holiday season, early dining. It was a strong holiday buildup, peak holiday dining period in December. January, we had a post-holiday surge, and New Year's was some rebound. That's what AI thought because it didn't have the context to know that November 7th was also a home win against the Panthers after a loss the week prior. It did not know that December 5th was a close game home win against the Chiefs. That December was a division win against the Browns after the Browns had beat them earlier in the season. This was the final regular season win against the Ravens, and this was the first playoff win against the Ravens. So I put this in here as a cautionary tale that as a data storyteller, you need to understand your data better than anyone else, because if you rely on things like an AI, they could tell you the wrong story. And the story that they tell isn't illogical. It's just not right based on what was actually happening. And if you would follow this came with recommendations of what to do and how to change your strategy. And it all would have led down the wrong path and could have led to wrong decision making. So again, I think there's value if you are good at telling the data's story. That's what we're going to work on. That's what we need to do. So we're almost wrapping up here, but we did want to talk a little bit about the how visuals can drive impact. So this slide is obviously all numbers. There are some stats in there. You might miss them if you're just reading over it. Visuals don't have to be complicated. Sometimes people think that visuals have to be, complex graphics or flowcharts or whatever they are. But really, you can have visual impact by just changing your font color, your font size, anything like that to draw emphasis on what you want the people to get. So this is the exact same slide, but now you can see that I want you to know that visuals improve learning by up to 400%. I also want you to know that 80% people remember 80% of what they see and do, 20% of what they read, and 10% of what they hear. This exact same information was on the previous slide, but I'm not sure, it's easy to get lost for the percentages to get lost in all the writing. So your visuals can be simple. I'm not saying this is the most visually wonderfully designed slide, but it can help. Visuals don't have to be complicated when you have them. Oh, and the consideration, if you have a paragraph to explain your point, consider a visual, a chart, a graph, something else. So the last step here is inspire action, because obviously knowledge without action is somewhat futile. What you want is you want something to happen with what you're doing. And it's your responsibility as a storyteller to make that action clear, connected, and logical so the person can follow through with it and then know what to do. So one final little tool that I have is the OK Cool test. I always said I was going to name this something better than this, but here we are rolling with it. So it's called the OK Cool test. What this basically is a gut check to see if your slide or the story, I've used it for both, is complete and likely to drive action or discussion. So how you use this based on your current state of your slide or your story, again, I've used it on both. Will my audience just say, okay, cool, and move along? Think back to the example of sales and mentioning how this content had great engagement rate. The client might say, okay, cool. Awesome. So that's not really what you want when you're telling a story. So if your slide or the whole story does not lead to discussion, questions, or aha moment or action, then it's probably not done. And again, not everything has to be an aha moment. Sometimes you can present a slide and say, hey, this I found really interesting. I think you'll find it interesting too. I'm not sure what to do with it. Let's discuss. Or it might spark questions, but there's something there that has value that is more than just someone saying, got it, cool. So another, again, little checklist as you think of this is, does the information on the slide relate to results my stakeholder cares about? Again, the engagement rate versus sales. Do the data points I have provided lead to a logical and relevant so what? You want to make sure that there's value in what you have there. Can the contents of the slide drive a discussion or action, or is there some follow-up that can happen from this? And again, if you're looking at the whole story, not every slide has to be groundbreaking. Sometimes you will have build-up slides that lead to an overall question or discussion. Totally fine too. But you just need to make sure that overall, collectively, that they are a cohesive part of the story and a necessary part of the story. And will my stakeholders understand the main point I'm trying to make on this slide? I think we've all probably been in a situation where you start finding all this cool stuff and you put it on in a deck or a report, and then you're like, whoa, there's just too much here. And that can overwhelm your recipient. And then they say, okay, got it, cool. And they just kind of move along. So you want to make sure that they can understand the main point of the slide. So to wrap up, stories are known to be 22 times more memorable than facts alone. So that's why it's important to put our facts into stories that people can remember. And we're going to test this out a little bit. I didn't tell you there was going to be a test, but hopefully it's all right. So we told some stories throughout this deck or this webinar, and hopefully people retain some of that. So the first question is, how many pickup trucks are there in the world? Feel free to throw it in the chat if you remember. And then of those pickup trucks, what percent of the vehicles worldwide are actually pickup trucks? If you know that, feel free to throw that in as well. See, you guys are great. You have 100 million, 6%. This is great. This worked out. So that is how that just tells you the value is you may not have remembered that. Now you know a random fun fact that you can take with you. So that's the end here. I know we zipped through a lot, so if people have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or whatnot, and we can start to address that.
Amanda, nice job. This is incredible. You can all see why we love having Amanda around. She's always challenging us and testing us and making us better. I have a quick one for you while some
Okay.
other questions start coming in. If you had to choose one or the other, you can only choose one. Would you rather have a forecast or a report? So like a prediction or a like summary of results after the fact?
So realistically, I would like not to have to choose, and I would just like both. But if I had to pick one, I would say start with the forecast, because if you don't have that, again, going back to the idea of setting expectations, big expectations, girl, if you don't have the expectations and the goals, then the report becomes challenging and potentially misguiding, or may not have the impact that you want. So if I had to pick one, I'd start with the forecast and then add a nice like fast follow of the report, even if they didn't ask for it, because it's important. Do your
I love
reports.
it. I love it. Looks like Elizabeth lost her North Star a while back, so we can try to help her find her. I had a coffee meeting this morning, and I won't mention who or from where, but he said we got 90 million impressions since I think it was May until like the end of September. And he goes, "Is that good? Like, I don't know. How do I know if that's good? How would you answer that question?"
So I think that's a very common question, and that goes back to the importance of understanding, is that what you wanted to drive? Is that really what you were tasked to do? Also, so I feel like a lot of times we do try to get a little bit beyond just an impression into an action. We want to make sure those impressions were to the right people. So there'd probably be some follow-up questions to ask if that was good, to really understand that. But this also speaks to the importance of having those goals and those expectations set early, because that's what helps you understand if it's good. If they were expecting 180 million impressions, then I'd say, man, you might have some work to do. If they were expecting 50 million, then yeah, knocked it out of the park. That's great, if that's what you were trying to drive. So I would say that leads to the importance of setting up those expectations and those goals.
Love it. Love it. And Misha from St. Ursula Academy, Go Bulldogs, had a question about ads and boosting. And we have a personal story about this. She said she heard that boosts tend to be shown to followers and ads through a business manager, I assume she's speaking
Yeah.
of, are more for non-followers. Can you vouch for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we saw in that example. Like, we did the test where we saw that the engagement was different, and we were trying to really understand why. First, we thought maybe it was the type of content was different, but then we did the test where it was the exact same content. And with our tool that we had used Sprout, where they kind of give you that fan or follower, non-follower, we were just really finding that followers, when the boost button, the way the algorithm worked and Facebook approached it, it was not uncommon for those posts to have their audience be 30 to 40% followers, versus ads manager 15% at most, sometimes less than that. So it is something that is just the way that Facebook works. Now, if you're in Ads Manager, you can always adjust that audience based on certain parameters, which is what we ended up doing, which allowed us to have the best of both worlds. We were able to have that more engaged audience, but also have the organization that ads manager provided. All and like the ability to control the objective. Because sometimes when you boost, you have limited objective control. So ads manager allowed us to have a little bit more of that. So we had kind of the win-win of all of it. And by having more of that control and having more of that targeted content and understanding it, it improved performance across the board. So that was great to see.
Awesome. What's one metric, whether it's an acronym or not, that people tend to misunderstand? Is it like the difference between reach and impressions, or is there something else? Like what do you tend to have to answer over and over again that feels obvious maybe, but is worth restating?
I think sometimes it can be a little bit misleading of like what a conversion rate is. And sometimes I think you have to understand that sometimes conversion is a sales conversion. Sometimes it is a conversion to click something because that's as far as they can go. People like to talk about this conversion rate or we're going to optimize the conversion rate, but sometimes based on the data that you have available or really what you're trying to do, that can mean different things. So you have to make sure that you again align on what a conversion is and how you want to define that. And then everybody can move forward on a conversion rate. So, and how that is. I also, FYI, just love everything as a rate because I think it gives you an automatic context. Sometimes if it says like, hey, we saw X go up 20%. Let's say we saw engagements go up 20%. That's great unless impressions went up 75% and your engagement rate is actually went down and your content is actually less engaging. So I do say kind of as like a little extra thought is just around like whenever you can provide that automatic context, I just think it helps tell the story a little bit quicker and a little more clarity. So that extra tidbit.
Is there anything else besides like the okay cool test that would indicate that you're maybe sharing too much data or like you're losing people, like maybe you're presenting live or virtually to a client? Is it eyes glazed over?
I was
Is
gonna
it
say, anytime you see the crowd and and you just start to see it all go in the back of their head, then you can
yeah.
start to be like, yeah, okay, I need to wrap this up. I need to get to the main point. Sometimes, well, that's always good to kind of share your information before if you have a big client presentation with somebody who's a little bit less interested in the data, maybe they are more on the storytelling side because you can start to get that vibe pretty quickly from others too. So kind of run through it. And if they say, maybe that's too much, there's good to have a good gut check person where you can share them with and they can be like, yeah, you're going too deep. I know you want to, but just nope, your point's made. You don't need to go any further. Got it. You're done.
That's good. That's good. Awesome. Well, I know a lot of you are waiting to see who gets to win our awesome library bundle. And so I'm going to pick a winner, and then Tom, I see you kind of peppered in your question here, so we'll get to that right after this. Let me share my screen for the wheel of names so you guys know that I'm not picking favorites here, although I took our team out. So I'm going to click to spin. You guys can all see that. Okay. Elizabeth Barron. Awesome. So we'll get with you afterwards and get those books to you, and you get to spend some quality time with Amanda Fleck. So congratulations. And in case anybody's wondering too, we are going to send a full recording of this so you can watch the replay at any time. And I think one more thing I wanted to share real quick too is that we're going to continue to offer these great resources from the Dooley team. And one of the newer offerings you may be familiar with is called the Dooley Deep Dive. And this is a little bit more kind of deeper dive into some topics that we're really passionate about, including, for instance, social ads budgeting. But Amy alone is offering a three-part video series about making the most of your paid media budget. And then Lindsay on our team coming up just before the holiday season is going to get into why Black Friday is more than just a sale. It's a moment and how brands can take full advantage of that. So more webinars, more deep dives. We'll have more live events too. CreatorCon 2026 is just right around the corner. So stay tuned. And then let's see, Tom. Let's see, would not one usually drive expectations from forecasts? Amanda, can you see his comment? Do you want to address that real
Yep.
quick and then we'll hop
Yep.
off?
Yeah. And
Awesome.
expectations should come from a goal or a forecast or anything there. So if you have that, absolutely. And that's really they can go hand in hand. It's just making sure that that's communicated to the people who need to understand it. We had was a communication not with us, but with a different client where we saw an example where another one of their vendors was like, hey, we got this going and it's great. We got X amount of people. And the client was like, we only got that many. We really wanted more than that. And that was an example of where they might have had the forecast. Maybe it wasn't communicated. Maybe the expectations weren't set. So you should have a goal or a forecast based and base it off that. It's just making sure that everybody knows that that's what's going to happen, and communicate that out so that it's clear.
Awesome. All right, that's all we got for you today. Great job, Amanda, as always, and thank you all for joining, and have a great day. See you all soon.